911, where's your emergency?
Someone just got shot at Sally's.
Okay.
It was a car that drove by.
AJ and his friends had no idea what was to come.
He was just walking to the store. That was all he was doing.
I ran down the street, and there's this young guy screaming.
KJ!
The faster we can solve it, and get somebody in custody, the better.
I don't think any of us ever imagined what he would really do next.
Yeah. Yep, bro.
18-year-old student and rising athletic star, Kelvin Taylor, lovingly known as KJ, lives at home with his parents.
Feeling positive, man. It's all in the mind.
I loved Kay so much. Kay just was special to me, his dad, our family, his classmates, his friends. There was no doubt in KJ's mind that his mother loved him, nor his father. We both loved the ground he walked on.
He was raised right. He was raised by a great mother and father. Every room he walked in, it got brighter, you know, and if you was having a bad day and you seen KJ, you smiled. He was someone you just needed to be around.
Yeah, for sure. Put me down for sure.
When I got home from work, KJ was on his phone sitting on the end of the couch.
All right, bye. Hey, Mom.
Hey, kiddo.
How was your day?
Oh, good, honey.
I heard his friends was on the motorcycles. And he said, Mom, I'll be back.
Oh, I'll see you for dinner.
Okay.
And I just looked up, and he got on the back of the bike. And then left. Kay was just different.
KJ is only just starting to fulfill his extraordinary athletic talent on the field.
Kay loved to play sports. Kay was a sports person. He was always playing football, from football to basketball, from basketball to AAU basketball, back to football. He was always in a sport.
God had blessed him with just raw talent. He could move, he could run, he could control his body better than anybody. From day one, you knew that he was special.
He really had the potential to be the next Tavon Austin or Wes Welker. He was the total package. He had everything that you were looking for in a player.
He knew what he didn't have in the neighborhood when he was growing up. And so he wanted to go to school, and he wanted to become successful.
All right, boys, let's go. Let's go.
He was great in other sports, like basketball, but football was his calling. Football was Kay's way out of here.
Hey.
He was wise. He knew that football was going to open doors for him and change his life. This is the journey that he was on.
In 2020, KJ helped his high school team become state champions and had his eye on West Virginia college football and beyond.
There's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't be watching my nephew on Saturdays. He said that once he made it, his plans was to come back and build a training facility to help train the youth and get them as best prepared to be successful and go further than him.
Let's go, bro. I got you.
The thing about KJ, he was going to be great, no matter what he did.
Where's your emergency?
Hello, somebody just got shot up in here on Central Avenue. Someone just got shot at Sally's.
Okay.
It was a car that drove by.
Damn, I just heard shots. I'm looking out my window.
Dispatchers were receiving 911 calls that a shooting had occurred. There had been multiple shots fired in the Central Avenue area of Charleston, West Virginia.
Attention 408. Reported shooting, 829 Central Avenue. Time now 2013.
Officers were actually in the area, pretty close by.
Charleston Police Department arrived on scene within seconds of the actual shooting.
They arrived on scene. It was really chaotic.
They weren't sure that the shooter had fled the scene. They approached that scene with caution.
They located the victim laying on the ground. Had a single gunshot wound to the chest. Several other people around him frantically trying to give him assistance. Some people were saying it was a truck had driven by and fired several shots, which struck the victim. Everybody on scene said, "Hey, that's KJ Taylor."
There was a knock at the door, and it was my homegirl, but she was out of breath.
It's KJ! KJ!
And she screamed, "KJ just got shot."
Metro Medic 437, respond to the area, Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue.
I ran down the street. It is so many people out there, like, so many people. And there's this young guy screaming.
Let me through! That's my son! KJ!
I'm trying to get through there, and the police won't allow me to get to there. And all I see is my son, laying on the ground.
KJ was Tara Richmond's only son. He was the light in his mother's eyes. As a parent, I can't imagine what Tara went through.
KJ is rushed to the ER.
Me and my husband chased that ambulance all the way down the street. And then one of my homegirls pulled it up, and she drove us to the hospital.
Soon after, Charleston detective John Hill arrives at the crime scene.
What we got? It was still kind of chaotic. There was tons of people everywhere. We put the crime scene tape kind of farther back to where it gives us space to process the scene.
They're having to worry about, the collection of evidence and the preservation of evidence, keeping that crime scene secure.
I walked over to the corner where it occurred, right in front of the corner store. And there were several bullet holes into the window. The first thing we look for is usually like shell casings. The bullet fragments, that we did find several bullet fragments that went through the window of the corner store. If we locate a possible weapon, we could kind of tie it back to that scene. The faster we can solve it and get somebody in custody, the better.
Not K. Not K. No.
KJ had never had any problems with the police, but there's several incidents that have occurred, like shootings in the past, around the corner store there. I knew there was a camera on a pole based on other investigations that I've had. If it was active, if it was working, it might help us out, might identify who was there with KJ and get an actual video footage of the incident.
I would not be able to sleep until I got to see what was on that camera, because of the potential of what it could bring to the investigation.
You ready? Ready. We get a license plate, we can track that license plate down to see, who the vehicle's registered to, who's the owner, where they live at. Because sometimes the video's clear enough to where you actually see inside of vehicles and see faces. Could make or break your case. It's what we live for as police officers.
Can you cue it up to just before 7 p.m.? Okay, play it from there.
As soon as I open it up, I see the corner store, Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue. I see the entire area where the incident occurred. We see KJ and his two friends. They show up on scene riding dirt bikes.
It's a weird feeling because you're getting ready to watch the last moments of someone's life. and they have no idea that it's coming.
Rewind. Freeze up.
They're coming down Glenwood Avenue.
Play on.
They turn in front of the corner store.
Zoom in.
KJ was wearing a red shirt. Park their dirt bikes, get off, kind of hanging out and talking to people right in front of the store.
Hold it. Play it again.
You see one of KJ's friends go inside, and KJ's wearing this red shirt. He's just kind of standing outside, waiting on his friend to get out.
There it is. Rewind. Play it again. Zoom in.
You see KJ approaching the store as he is getting closer to the door. You see the suspect vehicle come into view.
You see it come by at a high rate of speed.
You see a very brief moment where they hit the brakes.
You actually see muzzle flash coming off the glass of the store.
There were multiple shots fired.
And then KJ falling. And then the suspect vehicle continues fleeing the scene, and next thing you know, it's chaos. People are running around.
These are not grown men, these are children. And they are running, and they are hiding, they are afraid. It's heartbreaking. This is not just a video. This is real life. And this is a moment where a child is stolen from their family.
Rewind.
We pause it. See if I can get a good picture of who's in that truck.
Zoom in.
You could not see who was driving that vehicle. You could not distinguish what the license plate was.
While the poll camera was beneficial for us and that it showed the actual shooting, at that point we didn't know anything about the occupants of the vehicle.
All we know is that truck is the suspect vehicle. Whoever was in that truck, that's the person that killed KJ Taylor.
Without a license plate to trace the vehicle, Detective Hill canvasses the area for more cameras.
KJ and his friends fled from the scene, traveling east on Central Avenue toward Five Corners. And it's the intersection on the west side of Charleston that a bunch of streets all meet at once. We need to check at these spots. There's a business right there at Five Corners that has a great camera that points right at Central Avenue. Maybe if they stopped at the light, I could see inside and maybe see some faces.
Detective Hill takes the hardware store footage back to the station.
Can you cue it up to 6:50 p.m., please? Sure. Scroll it on, please.
All of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle's flying at high rate of speed.
Rewind.
I rewind it, paused it, and did step by step, frame by frame. And as I'm watching it, I look in and I can see, hey, there's two people in that truck.
Zoom in.
We got to see how big they were. We got to see what they're wearing.
And I could see the driver's got a white shirt on and the passenger's got a red shirt on. Usually the passenger is the one who's firing because they're not focused on driving.
I can't make out the license plate.
With no more leads from the CCTV, police track down one of KJ's friends, seen running away from the scene.
Thank you for coming in. I'm Detective Hill. This is Detective Marsh.
He was brought into the Criminal Investigation Division. He was very upset. He and KJ were friends. He was traumatized.
We want to know, has KJ had any problems with anybody?
Do you know who shot KJ?
No. Everyone loved him.
He said he didn't have any problems with anybody. He didn't have any enemies. He said that he was at the 2nd Avenue Center, which is a community center, there a couple blocks away, playing basketball and hanging out with KJ and some other friends. Maybe something happened there. Maybe something happened while they were playing basketball. Maybe something happened while they were riding dirt bikes in the street. It could be somebody that they knew that they got in an argument with, or it could be a complete stranger.
Detective Hill retrieves the security footage from the community center to see if anything occurred prior to the shooting.
Can you start at 6:50 p.m.? Okay, play it from there. There they are.
They were just hanging out, having fun, talking to friends, riding their dirt bikes up and down the street, just having a normal evening.
Rewind. Okay, play it from there.
There's some people in vehicles. There are some other people just kind of gathered around. Everything seems fine.
Scroll it on, please. Okay, play it from there.
They're starting to load up on their bikes to leave. And next thing you know, I see the suspect vehicle passing them.
There's the truck.
Immediately passes them, kind of swerves around them. Hits his brakes, turns up a street.
Can you switch to the second camera? Rewind. Okay, play it from there. Freeze it. Looks like they're stalking them.
Watching the video, it became obvious that KJ and his friends had no idea. They had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Detective Hill still has no information on the truck.
Freeze it. Zoom in. It's no use. I can't make out the license plate.
Detective Hill returns to the community center and retraces the path the truck traveled before passing KJ.
We began just walking around the streets, seeing what we could see, and we found several cameras on some houses.
Good afternoon, sir. Detective Hill. Is your camera working?
We have this one residence that's pointing kind of towards 2nd Avenue.
Can you cue it up to 7:50 p.m.?
And all of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle comes up the street and turns right on 2nd Avenue.
Rewind. Can you go frame by frame?
I see it's a Ford F-150. And then I start also seeing other things that kind of break it down to make it a little bit more identifiable.
Freeze it.
It's two-tone. It's two-tone silver and gray. It's what we call either a step side or a flare side truck. It's just a different model of an F-150.
Zoom in.
We're doing what we can do to try to figure out what we can see from the license plate, but I really can't make out much other than that it's the West Virginia license plate.
But the video is good enough that a member of public might recognize the truck.
So the decision was made to release the video to media, social media, anywhere we could just to get it out there to maybe we can get some kind of tip or some lead to follow up on.
As the hunt for the killer continues, Kelvin Taylor's funeral takes place.
It was held in the Vicks Coliseum in Charleston.
It was just so many people. It was overwhelming.
Mayor, police chief, I believe, a couple pastors, high school coaches, friends, family, people that we didn't know that he impacted himself.
The outpour the people gave to me and my husband was unreal.
I tried not to cry, but the tears flow down my face. But just to see everybody show up and support their family and him, well, it was amazing. It gave people a sense of like, we got to stick together. But when you look in the front, you see KJ in the casket. It tears you apart.
But if it wasn't for that outpour, we probably wouldn't know where we would be at right now.
That Sunday, I came into the office and I noticed that I had gotten a voicemail.
1:37 p.m.
And it was the individual saying that they believed that they were the owner of the vehicle that we had released to the media. So I immediately contacted them.
She was able to provide a description of the vehicle with the make and model.
You sold it to who?
They told me that they were the owner of the truck, but they had sold it months prior.
Do you know who has it now?
Try to get as much information as I can about that person. We got to track them down.
That's great. Thank you, ma'am.
Detectives stake out the address of the person said to be the new owner, but there's no sign of the truck.
I get a phone call from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. They had just received a call from an anonymous tip saying that the suspect vehicle was parked in between some trailers up in an area called Halls Drive. I immediately began traveling to Halls Drive. We pull up, and I see it for the first time. a silver and gray two-tone Ford F-150.
They were able to seize that vehicle to allow an opportunity to get a search warrant to later search that vehicle.
Efforts to follow up on the original owner's lead hit a dead end.
Hill speaking.
But investigators receive an anonymous tip linking the vehicle to a man named Dakotas. Detective Hill has heard the name before.
Thanks for letting me know.
Dakotas Thomas. His name had been brought up several times with the Charleston Police Department. He was always just on our radar, and I knew that he was a violent guy, he was a dangerous guy. We needed to check it to see if it's Dakotas Thomas driving the truck.
The license plates have been removed, but Detective Hill finds the truck's unique vehicle identification number.
I took the VIN number from the truck and placed it in our database. I learned that the truck had actually got an oil change on April 7th, which was the day of the homicide. I need to go to the garage where the oil change was done at and see what I can find out.
Do your cameras work?
I spoke with employees there who were able to print me out a receipt, which gave me the time of the oil change.
It was somewhere around 2:30 in the afternoon when the oil was changed in the truck.
Can you play it from 2:30 p.m., please?
We began watching the surveillance video. We're looking for who's in that truck.
Look, freeze it. Rewind. Play it again.
I see the truck pull in. I can't make out any faces.
Can you switch to the interior camera?
It showed the truck there, but it did not show the passenger that well.
When you're seeing the red shirt, the same as the video footage from Andrews Flooring and Hardware.
The passenger may be obscured,
Can you switch to the second camera?
but the driver, wearing a white t-shirt, is clearly visible.
Which is, again, like that video footage from Andrews Flooring.
Look, zoom in.
As soon as I saw that, I saw his face, I was through the roof ecstatic.
The person driving the vehicle was Dakotas Thomas. Being able to put a face to this crime was very important. We knew at that point that we had at least one of the suspects identified, one of the people that were involved in this murder identified.
To find the shooter in the passenger seat. First, we needed to capture Dakotas Thomas.
Police find the details of Dakotas Thomas's last known address, a trailer in Poker, Putnam County.
I obtained a search warrant for the trailer. We made an approach on the trailer. Your adrenaline's up. You never know what you're going to experience. You never know what you're going to find. Your senses are heightened.
This guy's certainly considered armed and dangerous.
We made our approach from the trailer, made entry into it.
All clear, guys?
We did not locate anybody inside. During our search, we located a red hooded sweatshirt. There was a burn mark in the lower back part. I was like, hey, this could be something.
With Dakota seen wearing a white T-shirt, the red hoodie could belong to the passenger and suspected shooter, whose identity remains unconfirmed.
The next morning, it began processing the interior, which was taking DNA swabs from the door handles, the steering wheel, from the F-150 pickup truck.
During the search of that vehicle, it was noted that there was a particular burn mark in the passenger seat. That red shirt showed a burn mark that would have lined up with the burn mark in the seat of the truck. Law enforcement officers believed at that time that a shell casing had been ejected from the firearm and fallen behind the individual that was in the passenger seat.
And as I'm looking at the burn mark, I noticed in between the crack of the seat, between like the back of the seat and where I actually sat down at, I see a bullet fragment. So I started looking around inside the truck, and I noticed that the B-pillar, which is like where the door meets the truck, that it had been struck by a bullet.
It would have been impossible for the passenger to be able to have caused that type of damage.
And after seeing that, I knew that it had to be the driver that fired the shots at KJ.
The driver and the shooter involved in this murder was Dakota Thomas. Dakota Thomas became public enemy #1.
A warrant was executed to allow those officers to what we call ping his cell phone. They were able to pull information from both before and after the shooting.
Through his cell phone records, we learned that after he was in the area where he dropped the truck off of, he immediately appeared to flee toward Ohio.
There was a reward that was placed for anyone who could provide information of the whereabouts of Dakota Thomas. But it felt there were a lot of people that refused to talk to the police.
KJ was killed in April, and it went all the way to August.
Finally, law enforcement officers received a tip from an individual who knew the whereabouts of Dakota Thomas.
We kind of narrowed it down to an address in Akron, Ohio area.
That is when the U.S. Marshal Task Force closed in.
Notice, it's the U.S. Marshal!
He was a murderer. We all knew there was a significant concern for what he might do.
Just wondering in a row.
We needed to get him off the street.
I don't think any of us ever imagined what he would really do next.
Notice! Come to the door with your hands up! It's the U.S. Marshal!
People do crazy things trying to avoid capture. You know, they don't want to spend the rest of their lives in jail.
That encounter turned violent. It turned volatile, which is quite the understatement. He barricaded himself in and began throwing Molotov cocktails at the U.S. Marshal.
That perimeter will be ready. You went back in the house.
Unfortunately for Dakota, One of those cocktails didn't make it outside and set the house on fire that he had barricaded himself in.
So now he's in a bit of a pickle.
He attempts to escape through a window, eventually ends up on the roof of this residence.
At that point, he gave up, and the local fire department came with their ladders, got him off of the roof, and the marshals were able to take him into custody.
Once I got the phone call that they had Dakotas Thomas in custody and actually got a picture of him in handcuffs in the back of a police car, after all the hard work, all the long nights, all the long days of watching video, talking to people, everything that led up to this moment, I was so excited. I knew we had him.
We're about to burn the house down. That might be something else, but not for me.
Dakotas Thomas is found guilty of the murder of KJ Taylor, and on December 2nd, 2022, is sentenced to life without parole. Dakotas Thomas admits he was targeting one of KJ Taylor's friends over a disagreement.
The video, it's telling us what happened. They played basketball. They were just hanging out, having fun, just having a normal evening. AJ and his friends had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Dakotas Thomas was reckless enough to discharge a weapon from a moving vehicle in a very crowded area.
And KJ Taylor was the one who was hit.
We watched that video probably hundreds of times, and every time that we watched it, we hoped that it wasn't going to happen that time. We hoped that he wasn't going to get shot that time, but of course that's what the video showed.
I never really understood how big of a role video surveillance plays until this case.
That footage is really what blew the case open. That footage is what gave us the truck so that we could go from there and try to figure out who it was that had done the shooting.
I do not believe that law enforcement officers would have been able to solve this crime in the absence of video footage.
KJ Taylor was a son. He was a friend to a lot of people. He was a mentor to a lot of children, and he was just starting his life. You know, KJ didn't get into any kind of trouble. He was doing the right thing, and unfortunately, his life was cut short.
KJ was real, you know, and I admired that so much about him, that there was no fluff. There wasn't a KJ that you got as an adult, and then he walked out the door and was somebody else there. You know, you knew where KJ stood every day.
I think we should remember Kay as somebody that made it. Somebody that grinded for what he wanted. Somebody that would give you the shirt off of his back if he loved you and he knew you loved him.
Losing him really made this community a better place. It drove people. It made people take life more serious in our community. So, but it's hard, you know.
In the weeks following, the street KJ grew up on is renamed in his memory.
That street is so special to his parents and his family and his friends in the community. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm glad that street is there because he deserves it.
I want the world to know the truth about KJ. Like, KJ was a great guy, you know, because I love the ground he walked on. I just love him. And I'm never, ever, as long as I...
The dawn that broke over Pike County, Ohio, on April 22nd, 2016, carried a deceptive stillness, the kind of quiet that usually promises a peaceful spring day in the heart of Appalachia. The rolling hills of southern Ohio were beginning to blush with the first pale greens of the season, and the morning mist clung to the valleys like a damp shroud, obscuring the gravel paths and the isolated trailers that dotted the landscape along Union Hill Road. This was a place where the distance between neighbors was measured in acres of thick woods and rolling farmland, a community where privacy was a respected currency, and the sounds of the night were typically limited to the rustle of deer or the low hum of a distant tractor. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long, angular shadows across the rural landscape, the silence began to feel heavy, an oppressive atmospheric weight that suggested the world had stopped breathing in the dark hours before the light arrived. The first crack in this silence didn't come from a gunshot or a scream. Those sounds had already been swallowed by the night and the thick insulation of the rural dwellings. It came from the frantic, uneven heartbeat of a family member arriving for a routine morning visit. Bobby Jo Manley, a sister to one of the residents, walked up to the door of the first trailer, expecting the smell of brewing coffee and the familiar sounds of a household waking up. Instead, she found a door that yielded too easily and a silence that felt like a physical blow. When she stepped inside, the air was stagnant, carrying a metallic, iron-rich tang that caught in the back of her throat. In the dim light of the hallway, she discovered the bodies of Christopher Roden Sr. and his cousin Gary. The scene was an assault on the senses. The blood had pooled in deep, dark maroons against the worn linoleum, and the stillness of the men, who were just 40 and 38, was so absolute it seemed to defy the laws of biology. They had been executed with a clinical, terrifying precision, shot multiple times in the head while they were likely still dreaming of the day ahead. The horror, however, was only beginning its slow, rhythmic unfolding. As the alarm was raised and the first few frantic calls to 911 began to pierce the morning air, a secondary discovery was made just down the road. At the second location, the carnage had taken on an even more heartbreaking dimension. Dana Roden, the 37-year-old matriarch who had spent her life nurturing her family, was found dead alongside her two youngest children. Hannah Mae, only 19, and Chris Jr., just 16, lay in their beds, their lives extinguished in a flurry of gunfire that had targeted their heads with a surgical, cold-blooded intent. The show, Don't Tell, of the scene was found in the mundane details: a half-finished glass of water on a nightstand, the way the blankets were still tucked around a teenager's shoulders, and the agonizing contrast between the violence of the wounds and the peacefulness of the victims' resting positions. But amidst this landscape of absolute termination, a sound began to emerge that would haunt the first responders for the rest of their careers. It was the thin, high-pitched wail of a newborn baby. In the very room where Hannah Mae's life had been stolen, her 4-day-old infant lay untouched, a tiny, breathing miracle in a room filled with death. The child was still tucked into the blankets, unaware that the warmth of its mother had turned to the coldness of stone. This juxtaposition of a 4-day-old life and a 19-year-old's violent end created a psychological trauma that would define the Pike County massacre. Further in the house, a 6-month-old and a 3-year-old were also found alive, wandering or sleeping in the proximity of their murdered parents, their small footprints tracing patterns through the evidence that the investigators would later spend years cataloging. The killers had moved through these homes with a focused, narrow malice, sparing the infants not out of mercy, but because their targets were the adults who could stand in the way of a secret, dark objective. The third location, belonging to Frankie Roden and his fiancée Hannah Gilley, offered no reprieve from the nightmare. Frankie, 20, and Hannah, also 20, were found in their bedroom, their bodies marking the end of a young romance that was supposed to last a lifetime. The precision of the shots here, as in the other trailers, suggested a killer or killers who were intimately familiar with the layout of the rooms and the sleeping habits of the inhabitants. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no defensive wounds that suggested a fight for survival. The attack had been a shadow, moving through the halls with the silence of a ghost and the lethality of a professional hit. The killers had navigated the cluttered porches and the narrow corridors with a terrifying confidence, knowing exactly which door led to which life. The final piece of the initial puzzle was found several miles away at the home of Kenneth Roden. Kenneth, the 44-year-old brother of Chris Sr., was found in his own bed, a single shot to the head marking his inclusion in this systematic erasure of a bloodline. The geographic spread of the crime scenes, 4 distinct locations connected by miles of winding, narrow roads, painted a picture of a coordinated, military-style operation. This wasn't the work of a lone, crazed gunman in a moment of frantic rage. This was a choreographed symphony of violence, requiring multiple participants, synchronized timing, and a deep, simmering hatred that could fuel such a logistical undertaking. As the police tape began to crisscross Union Hill Road, the residents of Pike County realized that the danger wasn't coming from a stranger in the woods. It was coming from someone who knew their schedules, their locks, and their hearts. The atmosphere at the command post established by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation was one of controlled, high-stakes panic. Officers from every surrounding jurisdiction descended on the area, their boots crunching on the gravel as they moved between the yellow tapes. The weather remained stubbornly beautiful, the bright spring sun illuminating the blood-stained interiors and the shell casings that glittered on the floors like brass jewelry. The smell of the woods, pine needles, and damp earth mingled with the chemical scent of fingerprint powder and the heavy, copper aroma of the crime scenes. Every officer who entered those trailers walked out with a haunted look in their eyes, their faces pale under the brim of their hats. They were looking at the total annihilation of a family, a crime so vast in scale that it seemed to swallow the very identity of the small town. The hook of this story is the sheer, inexplicable nature of the violence. Why would someone kill 8 people across 4 locations and leave 3 infants alive? Why was there such a focus on the head, a method of killing designed to ensure there would be no survivors to tell the tale? The local community, gripped by a paralysis of fear, began to whisper. They talked about the marijuana grow-ops found at some of the properties, suggesting a Mexican cartel hit or a drug debt gone wrong. They talked about family feuds and old grudges that had simmered in the hollows for generations. But as the investigators looked closer at the victims, the teenage mother, the 16-year-old boy, the hard-working patriarchs, they saw something that didn't fit the profile of a professional gang hit. They saw a personal, intimate kind of cruelty. They saw an obsession that went beyond money or territory. Imagine the sound of the wind through the Ohio pines that evening, a low, morning whistle that seemed to carry the weight of the 8 souls lost. The town of Piketon, usually a place of simple routines and local gossip, was transformed into a fortress of suspicion. Doors that had never been locked were bolted and barred. Families gathered in their living rooms, clutching rifles and watching the dark tree lines for any sign of movement. The news trucks arrived, their satellite dishes pointing toward the heavens like strange, silver flowers, broadcasting the horror of Union Hill Road to a world that could scarcely comprehend the math of the tragedy. 8 dead. 4 locations. 0 suspects. The math of the crime didn't add up, leaving a void that would soon be filled by the longest and most expensive investigation in the history of the state. The forensic teams worked through the night, their floodlights casting long, flickering shadows against the sides of the trailers. They found the show, don't tell clues of a calculated ambush, the absence of forced entry, the specific caliber of the bullets, and the strange, chilling fact that the family dogs, notoriously protective, had not barked or had been silenced by someone they recognized. The investigators moved with a heavy, deliberate pace, knowing that the smallest detail, a footprint in the mud, a hair on a pillow, a shell casing tucked behind a bed frame, could be the key to unlocking the motive. They were not just collecting evidence. They were trying to reconstruct the final minutes of a family that had been systematically hunted in their sleep. The emotional core of the opening chapter is the image of those 3 children. A 4-day-old infant who will never know her mother's face. A 6-month-old who was found covered in the blood of his parents, but was physically unharmed. These children are the silent witnesses to a horror they cannot name, the survivors of a storm that wiped their family tree nearly bare. Their survival is the most haunting detail of the incident, a clue that suggests the killers were not indiscriminate monsters, but individuals with a very specific, very narrow list of people who had to die. They were people who could look at a baby and see something to be spared, while looking at that baby's mother and seeing something to be destroyed. This selective mercy is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Pike County Massacre. As the first day ended and the stars began to poke through the Ohio sky, the scale of the task ahead became clear. This was a war of attrition between the law and a group of killers who had planned their exit as carefully as their entry. The roads were gone, their trailers now hollowed out shells of forensic data, and the killers were somewhere in the darkness, watching the news and waiting for the dust to settle. The investigation would eventually lead to a family of 4, the Wagners, but on this first day, the Wagners were just neighbors, perhaps even people who offered a word of sympathy or a hand in the search. The betrayal was already in motion, hidden behind the grief and the chaos of the morning. To tell the story, we must walk through those 4 locations one by one. We must feel the cold air of the Ohio morning and hear the frantic, sobbing voices of the relatives who found the bodies. We must see the small, colorful toys of the children lying next to the evidence markers. We must understand that in Pike County, the earth is deep and the woods are thick, but the secrets of a family can be the deadliest thing of all. The story of the Rhoden family is a tragedy of a bloodline interrupted, a narrative of a night where the shadows came to life and moved with a purpose that was as ancient as it was evil. It is a story that begins with a morning of silence and ends with a reckoning that would change the face of Ohio justice forever. The pacing of this opening is a slow, agonizing crawl through the crime scenes. We don't jump to the arrests. We sit in the silence of Kenneth Rhoden's bedroom. We listen to the static of the police radios. We watch the way the morning light catches the dust motes in Dana Rhoden's kitchen, where she will never cook another meal. This is the setting and the incident, merged into a singular, horrific experience. The audience must feel the isolation of Union Hill Road, the vulnerability of a trailer in the woods, and the terrifying reality that in the dark, a locked door is only as strong as the person on the other side. The Pike County Massacre was not just a crime. It was an atmospheric collapse, a moment where the safety of the rural American life was shattered by a group of people who believed that blood was the only way to settle a score. We close this first part with the image of the police tape fluttering in the wind as the sun sets on April 22nd. The hills of southern Ohio are turning to silhouettes, and the investigators are just beginning to realize that the trail doesn't lead out of the county. It leads deeper into the heart of the community. The mystery of the 3 infants, the precision of the shots, and the coordination of the 4 locations are the hooks that will drag us into the next 2 years of investigation. Who could hate a family this much? Who could plan a military-style execution of a teenager and a grandmother? The answers are waiting in the next chapter. But for now, there is only the silence of the woods and the crying of the children who are left behind. The Pike County tragedy has begun, and the world is finally, fearfully, paying attention. To understand the magnitude of the horror that descended upon the Rhoden family, one must first understand the landscape of Pike County, Ohio, a place where geography and culture are inextricably linked. This is a region of the Appalachian foothills defined by its rugged beauty and its profound isolation. The terrain is a labyrinth of steep, timber-thick ridges and deep, shadowed hollows that seem to swallow the light even at midday. Pike County is a place where families have lived on the same plots of land for generations, where the surname you carry is a map of your history, your alliances, and your grudges. In 2016, the atmosphere along Union Hill Road was one of rugged self-reliance. Life here moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. It was a place of gravel driveways that wound long distances through the trees, of trailers nestled in clearings where the forest pressed tight against the walls, and of a silence so absolute that the sound of a distant engine could be heard miles away. This isolation was not seen as a burden by the residents. It was a sanctuary. It was the setting of a life lived away from the prying eyes of the city, a world where you mind your own business and expect others to do the same. The Rhoden family was a central pillar of this rural ecosystem. They were a sprawling, tight-knit clan known for their work ethic, their love of high-performance cars, and their deep-seated loyalty to one another. Christopher Rhoden Sr. was a man who embodied the spirit of the county, a mechanic and a handyman who could fix anything with an engine and who worked tirelessly to provide a life for his children. His ex-wife, Dana, was the emotional glue of the family, a nursing assistant who was known for her fierce devotion to her kids and her willingness to help anyone in the neighborhood. They lived in a series of mobile homes and houses scattered along Union Hill Road, creating a sort of family compound that spanned several miles. In this part of Ohio, home isn't just a building, it's the dirt beneath it and the people in the trailers next door. The social fabric of the Roden family was woven with the threads of everyday rural life. Backyard barbecues, late nights working on trucks, and the constant, noisy presence of grandchildren. However, beneath the surface of this pastoral scene lay the harsh realities of life in a struggling economic zone. Pike County, like much of southern Ohio, was a place where the traditional industries had faded, leaving behind a vacuum often filled by the shadow economy. The discovery of large-scale marijuana grow-ops at the Roden properties during the initial investigation wasn't necessarily a sign of a drug cartel lifestyle, but rather a common, if illegal, way for rural families to supplement their income in a region with few opportunities. This detail is crucial because it colored the initial perception of the setting. To the outside world, the marijuana plants transformed the Rhodes from a tragic family into potential players in a dangerous game. But to the locals, it was just part of the landscape, a secret kept behind the tree line, no more or less significant than the livestock or the timber. The setting was one of contradictions, a place of deep family love and also a place where hidden gardens and guarded secrets were a necessity of survival. The weather in late April 2016 added a specific, haunting texture to the setting. The Ohio spring can be fickle, oscillating between the warmth of a new sun and the biting chill of a lingering winter. On the night of the murders, the air was crisp and clear, the kind of night where the stars look like ice crystals against a velvet sky. The woods were alive with the subtle noises of the budding season, the rustle of dry leaves, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl. In such an environment, the total absence of sound from the Roden properties was the first true indicator that something was wrong. The family dogs, usually the vocal sentinels of the gravel drives, were strangely quiet that night. It was an atmosphere of enforced peace, a silence manufactured by those who knew exactly how to move through the brush without snapping a branch and how to approach a house without alerting the animals. The setting was a trap, and the Rhodes, tucked into their beds in the middle of their vast, familiar territory, never heard the predators coming. The social setting of Pike County is also defined by its outsider status. This is a community that is often wary of authority and deeply private about its internal disputes. In the hollows of southern Ohio, justice is often a local matter, and the police are seen as a distant force that only arrives when things have already gone sideways. This culture of privacy meant that whatever tensions were simmering between the Roden and Wagner families were kept strictly within the confines of private conversations and encrypted messages. The setting was a pressure cooker of unspoken grievances. To an observer driving down Union Hill Road on April 21st, it looked like a peaceful slice of Americana. But in the digital space and the quiet corners of the Wagner farm, a military-style campaign was being planned. The contrast between the physical beauty of the rolling hills and the psychological rot of the killer's obsession is the defining characteristic of this tragedy's backdrop. Pacing is vital to understanding the setting. Life in Pike County doesn't rush. It lingers. It lingers in the way a conversation happens over a truck hood, in the way a morning coffee is sipped on a porch, and in the way news travels from house to house. The investigation would eventually mirror this pace, stretching over 2 long years of silence and suspicion. The setting during those years was one of paralyzed vigilance. Neighbors who had once left their keys in the ignition and their front doors unlocked began to live behind deadbolts and security cameras. The very thing that made the setting beautiful, its isolation, now made it terrifying. Every shadow in the woods was a potential killer. Every unfamiliar car on the road was a threat. The geography of Pike County became a map of fear, with Union Hill Road serving as the scarred heart of a community that no longer felt safe in its own skin. Then there was the Wagner family property in nearby Adams County, the Skidmore Farm. While the Roden properties were a cluster of lived-in, somewhat chaotic activity, the Wagner farm was a fortress of order and control. It was a sprawling estate where Billy and Angela Wagner ruled over their sons, Jake and George IV, with an ironclad authority. The setting here was one of extreme seclusion and religious-tinged obsession. The Wagners were preppers in their own way, building hidden compartments in their vehicles and maintaining a level of surveillance over their own lives that bordered on the pathological. If the Roden setting was one of open doors and loud laughter, the Wagner setting was one of locked gates and whispered conspiracies. These two settings, the sprawling, messy Roden compound and the sterile, controlled Wagner farm, were on a collision course over a single, 3-year-old child. To show the setting of the Roden trailers is to look at the small details of their final night. A child's bicycle left on the grass, a pile of mail on the kitchen table, the flicker of a television left on for background noise. These were homes of comfort, however modest. They were places where children felt safe enough to sleep deeply and where parents felt secure enough to leave their windows cracked for the spring breeze. The tragedy is that the very intimacy of the setting, the closeness of the homes, the shared driveways, was used against them. The killers didn't have to search for their targets. They had the layout of every room memorized. They knew which floorboards creaked and which doors were left unbolted. The setting was a partner in the crime, providing the cover of the woods and the silence of the hollow to mask the movement of a family of killers. As we move deeper into the narrative, the setting of Pike County will transition from a place of mystery to a place of forensic excavation. The gravel roads will be choked with police cruisers, and the woods will be scoured by hundreds of agents in windbreakers. But the soul of the setting remains in the quiet moments, the way the mist still rolls off the hills in the morning, and the way the 3 surviving children will grow up in a county that is forever marked by the blood of their parents. The setting is more than just a location. It is the reason why the crime was possible and why it was so devastating. It is a world of deep roots and dark shadows, a place where the beauty of the landscape hides a capacity for violence that few could have imagined. Union Hill Road is now a name synonymous with a specific kind of American Gothic horror, a reminder that in the vast, quiet spaces of the heartland, a family's love can be met with a neighbor's unimaginable cruelty. The visual of the setting is a series of 4 houses, each one a different chapter of a single story. Chris Sr.'s house, where the patriarch fell. Dana's trailer, where the heart of the family was cut out. Frankie's home, where youth was extinguished. And Kenneth's place, the final, distant stop on a trail of blood. Connecting them all is the road, a winding, gray ribbon that held the family together in life and served as the path for their executioners in death. To understand the Pike County Massacre, you must walk that road in your mind. You must feel the gravel under your feet and the chill of the Ohio night on your skin. You must see the woods not as a scenic backdrop, but as a silent witness that watched as a family was erased from the map of the world. This is the stage where the tragedy was played out, a landscape that remains beautiful, haunted, and eternally changed by the night the shadows moved. To look at the Roden family was to see the beating heart of southern Ohio, a lineage forged in the rugged terrain of the Appalachian foothills where loyalty is the only currency that never devalues. They were a family of mechanics, loggers, and caregivers, people whose hands were permanently stained with the oil of a truck engine or the soil of a garden, and whose lives were lived with a transparency that made their sudden, violent end feel like a tear in the fabric of the universe. To the world, they would become a case study, but to the people of Pike County, they were the loud, laughing, and fiercely protective clan that defined the community along Union Hill Road. Each member of the family was a distinct thread in a tapestry that was woven with deep affection and a shared history of survival in a region that rarely offered a helping hand. At the center of this world stood Christopher Roden Sr., a 40-year-old man whose identity was synonymous with hard work and family devotion. Chris was the kind of man who could hear a hitch in an engine from 100 yards away, a master of the mechanical who spent his days under the hoods of trucks and his nights ensuring his children had everything they needed. He was a man of few words but immense action, a patriarch who maintained a close relationship with his ex-wife, Dana, for the sake of their 3 children. Their divorce had not been a shattering of the family, but a reconfiguration. They remained a unit, anchored by a mutual respect that is rare in the aftermath of a marriage. Chris Sr. was the provider, the anchor, the man whose presence on Union Hill Road gave the family a sense of permanence and security. Dana Manley Roden, at 37, was the family son, the source of warmth and the moral compass that guided them through the complexities of rural life. As a nursing assistant at a local care facility, Dana's life was dedicated to the service of others, a vocation that mirrored her role within her own family. She was known for her infectious energy, her fierce protective streak, and a kitchen that was always open to anyone who needed a meal or a listening ear. Her children were her masterpiece. Even after a long shift at the hospital, she would return home to engage in the chaotic, beautiful business of being a mother. She was the one who remembered the small details, the birthdays, and the anxieties of her teenagers, weaving a safety net of love that made the isolated trailers of Pike County feel like palaces of the heart. The younger generation represented the hope and the future of the Roden name. Clarence Frankie Roden, at 20, was a mirror of his father, athletic, skilled with his hands, and possessing a quiet confidence that drew people to him. He had recently become a father himself and was building a life with his fiancée, Hannah Gilley. Hannah was only 20, a young woman who had integrated seamlessly into the Roden fold, her gentle nature providing a perfect balance to the boisterous energy of the clan. They were a couple on the threshold of everything, their trailer filled with the soft clutter of a new baby and the blueprints of a future they would never get to build. To see them together was to see the promise of Southern Ohio, young people rooted in their land, committed to their family, and eager to carry the torch of their ancestors. Then there was Hannah Mae Roden, 19 years old and possessed of a spirit that was as vibrant as it was resilient. Hannah Mae was a young woman who lived with her heart on her sleeve, a devoted mother to her 2 young daughters and a sister who was inseparable from her brothers. Her life had been complicated by a tumultuous relationship with Jake Wagner, the father of her oldest daughter, Sophia. Yet, in the months leading up to her death, Hannah Mae had begun to find her footing, asserting her independence and focusing on providing a stable, loving environment for her children. She was the focal point of the hidden storm, the woman whose refusal to be controlled by the Wagner family would unknowingly set the stage for the massacre. Her beauty was not just in her appearance, but in her stubborn refusal to let anyone dictate the terms of her motherhood. The youngest victim, Christopher Roden Jr., was only 16, a boy who was just beginning to navigate the transition into manhood. Chris Jr. was a typical Ohio teenager, fond of the outdoors, deeply connected to his siblings, and possessed of a shy smile that could melt the resolve of his older sister. He lived in the shadow of his father and brother, learning the trades that had sustained the family for generations. His death was perhaps the most senseless of all, the snuffing out of a candle that had barely begun to burn. In the images left behind, he is often seen in camouflage or leaning against a truck, a boy of the woods whose life was inextricably linked to the ridges and hollows of Pike County. The extended family, represented by Kenneth Roden and Gary Roden, rounded out the portrait of a clan that stood together. Kenneth, 44, was Chris Sr.'s older brother, a man who lived a bit further down the road, but remained an integral part of the daily family rhythm. Gary, 38, was a cousin who was often found at Chris Sr.'s side, a constant companion in work and leisure. They were men of the land, soldiers in the quiet army of the working class, whose lives were defined by the chores they completed and the family members they supported. They were not victims in their own minds. They were men with responsibilities, men who expected to grow old in the hills where they were born. To understand the Rhodes is to understand the show, don't tell, of their existence. It was in the way they parked their trucks, in a formation that suggested mutual protection. It was in the way they cared for their dogs and the pride they took in their modest homes. They were a family that valued doing over saying. If a neighbor's roof leaked, a Roden was there with a ladder before they were even asked. If a child needed a ride, there was always a cousin available. They were a collective, a human fortress built on the principle that no one gets left behind. This deep-seated bond was their greatest strength, but in the eyes of their killers, it was their greatest threat. The Wagners realized that as long as the Rhodes stood together, they could never be fully dominated. The tragedy of the victim's story is found in the unfinished business of their lives. A 4-day-old baby girl, born just as the shadows were closing in, who will never know the sound of Hannah Mae's voice or the strength of her father's arms. A 3-year-old who will grow up with a jagged hole in his memory where a family used to be. The Rhodes were not just people, they were an ecosystem. When the Wagners opened fire that night, they weren't just killing individuals, they were clear-cutting a forest. They were destroying a legacy of laughter, a tradition of Sunday dinners, and a future of shared milestones. The contrast between the Rhodes and their killers is stark. The Rhodes lived with an open-hearted, often messy authenticity. Their yards were filled with the remnants of projects, their homes buzzed with the energy of multiple generations, and their disputes were loud and eventually settled. They were real in a way that the Wagners, with their sterile control and hidden agendas, could never be. This authenticity made them vulnerable. They didn't live behind gates or monitor their neighbors with hidden cameras because they couldn't conceive of a world where a neighbor would methodically plan their execution. They believed in the unspoken social contract of the county. You mind your business, you help when called, and you respect the blood. In the true crime narrative, these victims are often overshadowed by the brilliance or the complexity of the killers. But the Rhodes deserve the spotlight. They were the ones who built the community. They were the ones who worked the double shifts at the nursing home and the long hours in the garage. They were the ones who celebrated the birth of a new baby with a joy that filled the hollow. To tell their story is to acknowledge the sheer waste of the crime. The world is a colder, quieter place without the sound of Chris Sr.'s truck or Dana's laugh. The ridges of Pike County feel emptier without the Rhoden name echoing through the trees. We must remember them not as they were found, but as they lived. We must see Frankie and Hannah Gilley holding hands on the porch. We must see Dana Rhoden coming home in her scrubs, tired but smiling. We must see Chris Jr. exploring the woods he loved. By documenting their humanity, we refuse to let the violence of April 22nd be their only legacy. We reclaim them from the forensic reports and the crime scene photos. They were the Rhodes, a family of the foothills, a clan of the heart, and a testament to the enduring power of rural American life. Their story is a tragedy of love met with hate, of openness met with obsession, and of a family that was too beautiful for the dark hearts of their neighbors to endure. The final image of the family is one of unity. Even in death, they were found together, clustered along the road that bore their name and shared their history. They were a family that lived as one, and in a horrific, heartbreaking sense, they died as one. The victim story is the soul of this kitsch ban, the reason we examine the evidence, and the reason we seek justice. Because for the Rhodes, the world was a place of connection, and that connection was something worth dying for. As we move into the incident and the discovery, we carry the weight of these 8 lives with us, ensuring that their names are spoken with the respect and the love they earned in the hills of Ohio. The incident of April 22, 2016, was not a sudden explosion of violence, but the culmination of a cold, mechanical progression, a military-style operation executed with a level of detachment that borders on the inhuman. To understand the horror of that night, one must visualize the Wagners not as neighbors, but as shadows moving with a singular, lethal purpose through the pitch-black hollows of Pike County. They didn't arrive with sirens or shouts. They arrived with the silence of custom-made silencers and the calculated stealth of hunters who had spent months studying the migration patterns of their prey. The incident began long before the first trigger was pulled, in the quiet hours of the night when the Rhoden family, exhausted from a week of honest labor, surrendered to the safety of their beds, unaware that the very geography of their homes had been turned into a tactical map for their executioners. The Wagners, Billy, Jake, and George IV, approached the first location with a terrifying familiarity. They knew which gravel paths would crunch underfoot and which porch steps would groan under their weight. They had prepared for this moment like a special forces unit, wearing specific shoes purchased to leave misleading tracks and carrying weapons modified to whisper rather than roar. As they entered the first trailer, the air was thick with the scent of a family at rest, old coffee, laundry detergent, and the deep, rhythmic breathing of men who thought they were safe. The transition from sleep to eternity for Christopher Roden Sr. and Gary Roden was instantaneous. There was no struggle, no frantic plea for mercy, and no time to realize that the people they had once considered extended family were now standing over them with cold, vacant eyes. The shots were precise, targeted at the head, ensuring that the silence of the night would remain unbroken by anything as messy as a survival instinct. The killers then moved to the second location, the home of Dana Roden, with a relentless, predatory momentum. Here, the violence took on a domestic, almost intimate quality that makes the incident even more grotesque. They navigated the narrow hallway of the trailer, passing the colorful magnets on the refrigerator and the discarded shoes of a teenager, moving toward the bedrooms where the heart of the Roden family lay sleeping. Dana, the woman who had cared for the sick and nurtured her children, was executed in her bed, her life extinguished in a flurry of muffled pops that sounded no louder than a heavy book falling to the floor. Next were Hannah Mae and Chris Jr. The killers stood in the doorways of these young people, watching the gentle rise and fall of their chests for a fleeting second before ending their futures. In these moments, the Wagners weren't just killing people, they were executing a plan to clear a path to a child, treating the lives of a 19-year-old mother and a 16-year-old boy as administrative hurdles to be removed. The most chilling aspect of the incident at Dana's home was the selective mercy shown to the infants. The killers moved through the rooms with the clinical efficiency of shadows, their flashlights cutting through the dark to identify their targets. They saw the 4-day-old baby girl lying next to Hannah Mae, her tiny face illuminated by the pale glow of a nightlight. They saw the other young children in the house. And they did nothing. They didn't harm them, not out of a sudden surge of humanity, but because the children were the prize of the mission. The incident was a surgical strike designed to eliminate the obstacles of the bloodline while preserving the youngest branches for their own twisted garden. This cold-blooded discernment, the ability to kill a mother while leaving her newborn to cry in the dark, is the psychological hallmark of the Pike County Massacre. It reveals a level of premeditation that is far more terrifying than a blind, impulsive rage. The third stop was the home of Frankie Roden and Hannah Gilley. This location represented the destruction of a new beginning. Frankie and Hannah were young, in love, and focused on the future of their own small family. The killers entered their sanctuary with the same practiced ease, bypassing the family dogs that had been conditioned to recognize their presence or were simply overwhelmed by the speed of the intrusion. They found the couple in their bedroom, a space defined by the soft clutter of new parenthood. The execution was swift, a repetitive, mechanical act that left a 6-month-old infant to wake up in a bed soaked with the blood of his parents. The killers didn't linger. They didn't look back. They were checking off a list, moving through the Roden family tree like a winter frost that kills only the strongest blossoms. Every shot was a statement of total control, a declaration that the Wagner family's will was the only law that mattered in the hollows of Pike County. The final act of the incident occurred at the home of Kenneth Roden, several miles away. This was the cleanup phase of the operation, the closing of a loop. Kenneth was the outlier, the one who lived apart from the main compound, but his blood made him a target. The killers drove through the winding roads, the Ohio night air cool against their faces, perhaps already feeling the rush of their perceived success. They entered Kenneth's home with the same ghostly precision, finding him in his bed. One shot, one life, and the list was complete. The incident ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet withdrawal. The Wagners disappeared back into the woods and the backroads, returning to their farm to burn their clothes, destroy their weapons, and begin the long process of acting like grieving neighbors. They left behind a trail of blood that spanned miles, but a trail of evidence that they believed was non-existent. To show the horror of the incident is to focus on the sensory void it created. The way the televisions continued to flicker in empty rooms, casting blue light over the victims. The way the morning mist began to roll into the trailers through doors left slightly ajar. The sound of the wind chimes on Dana's porch, tinkling a cheerful, mindless melody while a grandmother lay dead inside. The incident was a total atmospheric collapse. It transformed a community of life into a series of static, forensic tableaus. The killers had performed a ritual of erasure, moving with a confidence that can only come from a complete lack of empathy. They didn't see the Rhodes as humans. They saw them as variables in an equation of custody and control. The logistics of the night are a testament to the Wagners' obsession. They had built hidden compartments in their vehicles to transport their gear. They had practiced their movements until they were a single, multi-headed organism of death. They had even accounted for the timing of the moon and the shadows of the trees. The incident was a dark masterpiece of planning, a crime that was perfect in its execution but flawed in its soul. As they drove away from the final location, the sun was just beginning to hint at the horizon, the first light of a day that would reveal the carnage to a world that was still sleeping. The killers had won the night, but they had planted the seeds of a 2-year investigation that would eventually unearth every secret they had buried in the Ohio mud. As the narrative of the incident concludes, we are left with the image of the 4 locations standing silent in the dawn. The Rhodes are gone, their voices silenced, their dreams aborted. The infants are the only ones left to bear witness, their cries the only sound in the hollow. The incident was a systematic deconstruction of a family, a night where the bonds of blood were met with the steel of obsession. It was the most ambitious and most horrific crime in the history of Ohio, not because of a number of victims, but because of the cold, calculating heart of the family that carried it out. The shadows had finished their work, and as the first relative pulled into the driveway, the incident transitioned into the discovery, and the world began its long, slow scream of realization. This part of the script must feel like a descent into a cold, dark well. There is no warmth here, no moment of hope. It is a chronicle of a hunt where the prey never knew they were being hunted. The incident at Pike County is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are not the ones who roar, but the ones who whisper, the ones who know your name, and the ones who can look at your children and then kill you in your sleep. It is the core of the tragedy, the moment where a family's love was overwhelmed by a neighbor's absolute, unyielding malice. The night of April 22nd was the end of the Rhodes, and the beginning of a nightmare that the state of Ohio would never be able to forget. Every detail, from the misleading shoes to the homemade silencers, points to a truth that is harder to stomach than the violence itself, that a family can sit around a dinner table and decide, together, to erase another family from the face of the earth. The morning sun of April 22nd, 2016, rose over Pike County with a cruel, indifferent brightness, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel of Union Hill Road. The mist that usually clung to the hollows had begun to burn off, revealing the vibrant greens of an Ohio spring, but the air remained stubbornly cold, biting at the skin of anyone brave enough to step outside. Bobby Jo Manley did not feel the cold as she pulled her vehicle up to the first of the Rhoden properties. She was moving through the motions of a routine morning, a sister coming to check on her brother, Christopher Rhoden Sr., and his cousin, Gary. She expected the familiar sounds of a household beginning its day, the clinking of a coffee pot, the low hum of a television, the greeting of the family dogs. But as she stepped onto the porch of the first trailer, she was met with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. The front door was not just unlocked, it was slightly ajar, a jagged line of darkness inviting her into a world that had ceased to make sense. The first thing that greeted Bobby Jo as she crossed the threshold was not a sight, but a smell. It was a heavy, metallic aroma that seemed to coat the back of her throat, the unmistakable, iron-rich scent of fresh blood. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, the horror revealed itself in the mundane setting of the living room and kitchen. Christopher Sr. and Gary were there, but they were no longer the men she had joked with the day before. They were forensic tableaus, their bodies positioned with a terrifying finality. The blood had pooled on the worn linoleum, turning into deep, dark maroons that looked like ink in the morning light. Bobby Jo's scream was a guttural, primal sound that tore through the quiet of the hollow, but there was no one left in that house to hear it. She stumbled back outside, her lungs burning with the crisp air, her mind a frantic blur of denial and terror. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely navigate the screen, and placed the call that would forever change the history of Southern Ohio. As the first local deputies arrived, their sirens wailing in a desperate, lonely cadence against the hills, the scale of the tragedy began to unfold with a rhythmic, sickening momentum. They didn't just find one crime scene. They found a trail of blood that stretched for miles. The second location, the home of Dana Roden, was where the heart of the community was truly shattered. When the officers pushed through the door, they found the matriarch of the family, Dana, along with her two youngest children, Hannah Mae and Chris Jr. The show, Don't Tell, of this scene was the most agonizing of all. Dana lay in her bed, the blanket still pulled up as if she were merely sleeping, but the violence visited upon her had told a different story. In the next room, 19-year-old Hannah Mae was found with her 4-day-old infant tucked into the sheets beside her. The child was alive, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythmic defiance of the slaughter that had occurred inches away. The 6-month-old and the 3-year-old were also found, wandering through the trailers or sleeping in the proximity of their murdered parents, their small footprints tracing ghostly patterns in the blood that had cooled on the floors. The investigators who first walked through those doors were seasoned men, veterans of the local force who had seen the worst of what poverty and addiction could do to a community, but they were not prepared for this. They walked out of the trailers with their faces ashen, their eyes glassed over with a shock that transcended professional detachment. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones over their radios, calling for the BCI, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. They realized they weren't dealing with a domestic dispute or a random act of violence. They were standing in the middle of a coordinated, military-style execution. The third location, belonging to Frankie Roden and Hannah Gilley, offered the same grim results. A young couple executed in their prime, their infant son found alive but covered in the physical remnants of his parents' end. The killers had moved with a ghostly precision, navigating the narrow hallways and the cluttered rooms without disturbing a single piece of furniture, leaving behind a series of scenes that looked like they had been frozen in time. As the sun climbed higher, the news began to ripple through the county like a shockwave. The media trucks arrived in a frantic swarm, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky like strange, silver flowers, broadcasting the horror of Union Hill Road to a world that could not comprehend the math of the massacre. The initial theories were born from the chaos and the fear that gripped the residents. Because the investigators found large-scale marijuana grow-ops at some of the properties, sophisticated operations tucked behind the tree lines, the cartel theory took hold almost immediately. People spoke in whispers about the Zetas, about drug debts, and about professional hitmen from across the border who had come to Pike County to send a message. The sophistication of the killings, the use of silencers, the lack of shell casings in prominent places, and the fact that the victims were all shot in the head while they slept, supported this narrative of a high-level criminal hit. It was a comforting lie for the community. It was easier to believe in a foreign monster than a neighborly one. The BCI agents arrived in their crisp windbreakers, their forensic kits held tight as they began the slow, agonizing process of processing the 4 locations. They moved with a clinical, quiet intensity, mapping the blood spatter and collecting the few physical clues the killers had left behind. They found the first true, man-hung man-moi, clues, not in what was there, but in what was missing. There was no forced entry. No doors had been kicked in, and no windows had been smashed. The killers had either possessed keys or had been welcomed in by people who trusted them. Even more chilling was the behavior of the family dogs. The Rhodes were known for their protective, loud hounds, dogs that would bark at a squirrel a mile away. Yet, on the night of the massacre, the neighbors heard nothing. The dogs had remained silent, suggesting they were either familiar with the intruders or had been neutralized by someone they recognized. This silence of the dogs began to pivot the investigation away from the cartels and toward a much darker, more intimate possibility. In the midst of the forensic sweep, the emotional fallout was a physical presence on Union Hill Road. Family members who had been barred from the crime scenes gathered at the police tape, their faces contorted in a mask of grief and disbelief. They stood in the gravel, clutching each other as the black body bags were carried out one by one. The sound of their sobbing mingled with the distant hum of the media's generators and the chirping of the spring birds, creating a cacophony of sound that felt surreal and mocking. The investigators found the fourth location, the home of Kenneth Roden, several miles away. Kenneth was found in his bed, a single shot to the head marking the end of the trail. The geographic spread of the killings, spanning miles of winding, difficult backroads, confirmed that this was a multi-person operation. It required drivers, shooters, and scouts. It required a level of logistical planning that suggested the killers had rehearsed their movements until they were a single, lethal organism. As the first day faded into a long, paranoid night, the discovery phase transitioned into a state of siege for Pike County. The sheriff issued a warning for the remaining members of the Roden family to arm themselves and stay indoors. The town of Piketon became a fortress of deadbolts and drawn curtains. Every shadow in the woods was a gunman. Every car that slowed down on a back road was a threat. The investigators, working under the harsh glare of floodlights, found the show, don't tell, evidence of the killer's arrogance. They found specific, misleading shoe prints, sneakers that had been purchased specifically to throw off the tracking dogs. They found signs that the scenes had been staged to look like a robbery gone wrong, yet the valuables remained untouched. The killers hadn't wanted money. They wanted the roads. The discovery was not just of bodies, but of an obsession so deep it had planned for every forensic countermeasure. The primary clues, the marijuana, the lack of forced entry, the silence of the dogs, and the infants left alive, formed a jagged puzzle that the BCI agents would spend the next 2 years trying to solve. They spent hours in the trailers, the air now thick with the scent of chemicals and the stagnant smell of a house that had lost its life. They cataloged the children's toys lying next to blood-stained pillows, the half-finished meals on the tables, and the unread text messages on the victims' phones. Each detail was a reminder of the humanity that had been erased. The discovery was a slow-motion car crash of a family's existence, leaving behind a community that was no longer sure who to trust. The cartel theory began to wane as the agents realized the killers knew the internal layouts of the homes, the dead spots, where the floorboards didn't creak, and the exact bedrooms where each person slept. By the time the final body was removed and the trailers were sealed with heavy chains and plywood, the discovery had provided a body count of 8 and a list of questions that seemed to have no answers. The air on Union Hill Road was finally clear of the morning mist, but it was now heavy with a different kind of fog, the fog of suspicion. The families of the victims were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the 3 infants who had survived the storm. The world watched as the investigation stalled, as the cartel leads went cold, and as the months turned into a year of silence. But in the quiet offices of the BCI, the agents were looking at a different set of names. They were looking at a family that had once been friends with the Rhodes. They were looking at the Wagners. The discovery of the bodies was only the first layer. The discovery of the motive would take much longer, buried deep within a dispute over a 3-year-old girl named Sophia. The atmospheric weight of the discovery lingers in the mind like the scent of wood smoke on a cold night. It is the image of a BCI agent kneeling in the gravel, his head in his hands, trying to process the sight of a 4-day-old baby in a room full of death. It is the sound of the wind whistling through the bullet holes in a trailer's thin walls. It is the realization that in the heart of America, a family can be hunted like animals in the dark. The discovery at Pike County was a forensic nightmare, but it was also a spiritual one. It proved that the hills and the trees of Ohio, which had always been a source of comfort, could also be a perfect shroud for a massacre. As the first chapter of the investigation closed, the state was left with 8 graves and a community that would never again look at a neighbor without wondering what they were capable of doing in the dark. The trail was cold, the clues were sparse, and the killers were already beginning to believe they had gotten away with it. But the infants were still alive, and their presence was a silent, ticking clock that would eventually lead the law to the gates of the Wagner farm. The investigative machinery that hummed to life in the wake of the Union Hill Road massacre was the largest, most expensive, and perhaps the most psychologically draining operation in the history of the state of Ohio. To understand the Guy fam and No Cut, the suspects and the dead ends, one must envision a war room saturated with the scent of stale coffee and the flickering, blue light of 100 computer monitors, where the faces of the 8 Roden victims stared back at investigators from a wall-sized map of the county. In the early weeks of the investigation, the atmosphere was a chaotic blend of high-stakes urgency and a crushing sense of futility. More than 200 law enforcement agents from the local, state, and federal levels descended on Piketon, turning the small town into a fortified encampment of tactical gear and forensic kits. Every gravel road was a potential lead, every whisper in a local diner was a potential tip, and yet, for the first few months, the trail felt as cold as the Ohio soil in midwinter. The investigators were not just looking for a killer, they were trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces seemed to belong to 3 or 4 different sets of crimes. The most prominent and distracting dead end was the cartel theory. It was a narrative that felt almost too perfect to be ignored. When the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation agents processed the Roden properties, they found more than just bodies. They found a sophisticated, large-scale marijuana production operation. They discovered hidden grow rooms and hundreds of plants tucked away in the thick woods behind the trailers. In the context of a rural massacre involving 8 people and surgical-style executions, the math seemed obvious. This was a professional hit ordered by a Mexican drug cartel over a territorial dispute or a massive debt. The media latched onto this story with a feverish intensity, broadcasting images of the grow ops alongside maps of cartel influence in the Midwest. For weeks, the investigation sprinted down this dark alleyway. Agents interviewed drug enforcement experts, tracked the financial movements of the Roden family, and looked for connections to organized crime networks across the border. They scoured the victims' phone records for calls to unfamiliar international numbers and searched for messengers who might have been sent to collect a debt. But the more they dug into the cartel angle, the less it made sense. Professional hitmen usually leave a message. They don't just leave 3 infants alive in a room full of corpses. The precision of the shots was there, but the business logic of the cartel didn't align with the selective mercy shown that night. It was a massive, time-consuming detour that led the investigation into a thicket of international shadows that eventually yielded nothing but silence. As the cartel theory began to lose its sheen, the investigation turned inward, toward the community and the families themselves. This phase was perhaps the most painful for the residents of Pike County. Every person who had ever had a dispute with Christopher Roden Sr., every ex-boyfriend of Hannah Mae, and every business associate of the family was brought into the interrogation room. The investigators looked at the show, don't tell, of the community's dynamics, the old grudges over land, the jealousies over mechanical skill, and the minor criminal infractions that define life in a struggling rural area. They pursued leads about a white van spotted on the road that night, a sighting that turned out to be a local delivery driver. They investigated a tip about a disgruntled former employee of the Rodens' garage, only to find the man had an airtight alibi. This was a period of noise. Thousands of tips poured in from the public, ranging from genuine concerns to paranoid delusions fueled by the local rumor mill. People accused their neighbors of having too much money suddenly, or looking too nervous at the grocery store. The investigators had to sift through this mountain of human anxiety, following each thread until it snapped. It was a landscape of broken leads and dead ends that left the task force exhausted and the public increasingly skeptical of their competence. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the forensic vacuum. The killers had been meticulously careful. They had used specific calibers of ammunition, but they had also been disciplined about collecting their shell casings. The lack of DNA evidence that wasn't Roden DNA was a haunting testament to the premeditation of the crime. The investigators were looking at perfect crime scenes. There were no fingerprints on the doorknobs, no foreign fibers on the carpets, and no signs of a struggle. This suggested that the perpetrators had not only worn gloves and masks, but had likely utilized some form of forensic countermeasures, such as changing their shoes or wearing ghillie suits to blend into the woods. The Guy fam were not just random killers. They were individuals with a high degree of technical knowledge and a terrifying level of patience. This realization led investigators to look at anyone in the county with a military or law enforcement background. further broadening the scope of the search into a sprawling, unmanageable net. However, amidst the noise and the distractions, a different kind of pattern began to emerge. The investigators started to look at the silence of the dogs. It was a detail that wouldn't leave the minds of the lead agents. The roads had protective dogs, dogs that were bred and trained to alert the family to any movement in the woods. Yet, on the night of April 22nd, none of the neighbors heard a single bark. This was the show, don't tell moment that pointed toward an insider. The killers weren't just familiar with the layout of the homes, they were familiar with the animals. They were people who could walk up a gravel drive at 2 a.m. and have the family hounds wag their tails instead of snarling. This pivot led the BCI to narrow their focus to the inner circle of the Roden family, the people who had once shared meals, holidays, and secrets with the 8 victims. It was in this narrowing of the field that the name Wagner began to surface with a quiet, persistent frequency. The Wagners, Billy, Angela, Jake, and George IV, were not strangers to the roads. In fact, they had once been close friends. But more importantly, there was a biological link. Jake Wagner was the father of Hannah Mae Roden's oldest daughter, Sophia. As the investigators began to dig into the relationship between the two families, they found a history of escalating tension that had been invisible to the casual observer. They found messages where Hannah Mae expressed fear of the Wagners' controlling behavior. They found a pattern of the Wagners attempting to dictate how Hannah Mae raised her child and who she was allowed to date. This was the breakthrough in waiting, but at the time, it was just another thread in a very tangled web. The Wagners were cooperative in their initial interviews. They seemed like grieving neighbors, providing alibis and expressing shock at the violence. They were so normal that they almost managed to blend back into the background noise of the county. The investigation then hit a significant no-cut in terms of physical location. In early 2017, the Wagner family did something that caught the eye of every agent on the task force. They sold their sprawling farm in Adams County and moved, en masse, to Alaska. To the public, it looked like a family trying to escape the trauma of a neighborhood massacre. But to the investigators, it looked like a tactical retreat. This move created a massive logistical hurdle. The BCI now had to coordinate with authorities in Alaska, monitoring the Wagners from a distance of 4,000 miles. The investigation became a game of high-stakes surveillance. Agents followed the Wagners through the frozen landscapes of the north, watching their every move, waiting for a slip-up that never came. The Wagners lived in a self-imposed exile, a tight-knit unit that allowed no outsiders into their circle. They didn't talk about the roads. They didn't communicate with anyone back in Ohio. They simply existed in a cold, silent bubble. This period of the investigation was one of agonizing stagnation. The evidence was in Ohio, but the suspects were in Alaska, and without a smoking gun, the authorities could do nothing but watch. Back in Pike County, the investigation was suffering under the weight of its own duration. The reward money for information leading to an arrest climbed to $100,000, but the quality of the tips remained low. The dead ends continued to pile up. One particularly harrowing lead involved a body found in a different county that investigators hoped was a hitman the killers had turned on, but DNA testing proved it was an unrelated murder. Another lead suggested that the weapons had been dumped in a specific lake, leading to a massive, expensive diving operation that turned up nothing but rusted fishing gear and old tires. Each of these failures was a blow to the morale of the task force. They were working 18-hour days, living in hotels, and sacrificing their own family lives to find justice for the roads, but the killers seemed to be ghosts who had vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. The psychological toll on the investigators was profound. They weren't just dealing with a cold case. They were dealing with the haunting presence of the 3 infants who had survived. Every time an agent looked at the photos of the crime scene, they saw the cribs and the toys, a reminder of the life that had been spared and the lives that had been stolen. The pressure from the media was relentless. Every anniversary of the massacre brought a new wave of criticism, with headlines questioning if the most expensive investigation in Ohio history was just a colossal waste of taxpayer money. The agents were accused of tunnel vision, of focusing too much on the Wagners and not enough on the real criminals, the cartels or the shadowy drug dealers. But the lead investigators held their ground. They had the silence of the dogs. They had the custody dispute. And they had a gut feeling that the answer was hidden in the hidden compartments of the Wagner family's vehicles. The show, Don't Tell, of the Wagner's guilt was found in their preparation for the move. Investigators discovered that before leaving for Alaska, the Wagners had obsessively searched for information on how to defeat polygraph tests, how to dispose of weapons in deep water, and how to track a person's movements via GPS. These weren't the actions of a family moving for a fresh start. These were the actions of a family preparing for a long-term evasion of the law. They had bought a specific type of trailer and modified it with hidden storage areas. They had traded in their vehicles for models that were harder to track. Every move they made was calculated, a cold and mechanical effort to stay one step ahead of the BCI. This behavioral evidence was compelling, but in a court of law, it wasn't enough to secure an indictment for 8 counts of aggravated murder. They needed the weapons. They needed the DNA. They needed the incidents of the night to be connected to the hands of the Wagners. The investigation was also complicated by the culture of silence in southern Ohio. Even as suspicions about the Wagners grew, few people were willing to speak out. In Pike County, you don't snitch on your neighbors, especially not neighbors as formidable and insular as the Wagners. People who might have seen something that night, a car on a back road, a light in the woods, kept their mouths shut out of a mixture of fear and a traditional distrust of the government. This social dead end was as formidable as any forensic challenge. The investigators were operating in a vacuum of information, trying to break through a wall of rural solidarity. They had to become part of the community, building trust with the relatives of the victims and the cautious locals, one conversation at a time. It was a slow, painstaking process of erosion, wearing down the defenses of the county until a few cracks began to appear. By the time the investigation reached its second year, the war room had been downsized. Many of the federal agents had returned to their regular duties, leaving a core group of BCI agents to carry the torch. The pacing of the investigation had slowed to a crawl. The public had largely moved on to other tragedies, and the roads were becoming a footnote in the long history of American crime. But for the remaining agents, the obsession had only deepened. They were now looking at the financial records of the Wagners with a microscope, tracing the money used to buy the Alaska property and the weapons they had acquired over the years. They were looking at the digital footprints, the deleted search histories, and the encrypted messages that the Wagners thought were gone forever. This was the long game, a battle of wills between a group of dedicated lawmen and a family of killers who thought they had won. The dead ends of the Pike County investigation are a reminder of how difficult it is to catch someone who has no conscience and a high degree of planning. The cartels, the random drifters, the disgruntled employees, each of these was a shadow that the investigators had to chase until they could prove it had no substance. The real suspects were always there, hidden behind the mask of neighborly concern and the vast distance of the Alaskan wilderness. The Gief Fam and No Cut phase of this story is a testament to the persistence of the law and the devastating power of a focused obsession. It is a narrative of missed opportunities and wasted weeks, but it is also the story of how the truth eventually becomes too heavy to stay buried. As the investigation moved toward its third year, the BCI was no longer just chasing shadows. They were building a cage, piece by piece, and they were waiting for the Wagners to step back onto Ohio soil. The final show, Don't Tell, of this chapter is the image of a single investigator sitting at his desk late at night, staring at a photo of Sophia, the child at the center of the storm. She was the prize the Wagners had killed for, the innocent life they had decided was worth the blood of 8 people. That photo was the anchor for the entire investigation. It was the reason the agents refused to accept the cartel dead end. It was the reason they followed the trail to Alaska. And it was the reason they would eventually find the evidence they needed in the most unlikely of places, a hidden well on a piece of property the Wagners thought they had scrubbed clean. The investigation was a marathon of frustration, but the finish line was finally coming into view. The shadows were starting to recede, and the faces of the Wagners were beginning to emerge from the gray mist of Pike County as the primary architects of the nightmare on Union Hill Road. The 2-year anniversary of the massacre had come and gone, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in the mouths of the investigators, and a heavy, suffocating cloud over the hills of Pike County. By early 2018, the investigation felt like it was encased in a block of Appalachian ice, immobile, cold, and seemingly impenetrable. The public's interest had curdled into a cynical frustration, and the cartel theory had finally been buried in the graveyard of dead ends where it belonged. But inside the secure, windowless offices of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the atmosphere was not one of defeat, but of a quiet, predatory focus. The lead agents had stopped looking at the horizon for foreign hitmen and had instead turned their microscopes inward toward a single, insular family that had once called the roads neighbors. The Wagners were no longer just names on a list. They had become a gravitational center around which every piece of circumstantial evidence began to orbit with an increasing, violent velocity. The breakthrough did not begin with a confession, but with a piece of hidden geography. For months, investigators had been obsessed with the idea that the Wagners, for all their tactical planning, must have left behind a physical signature. They began to dismantle the Wagner family's history with a surgical precision, looking at property records, vehicle sales, and the digital echoes of their lives before the move to Alaska. The turning point arrived when the agents stopped looking for what the Wagners had done on the night of the murders and started looking at what they had built in the weeks leading up to it. They discovered that Billy Wagner had purchased a specific type of trailer, a massive, enclosed hauler, and had spent hours in a secluded barn making modifications. This wasn't just carpentry. It was the construction of a mobile base of operations. The agents realized that the Wagners hadn't just driven to the crime scenes. They had moved through the county inside a Trojan horse, a vehicle designed to hide their silhouettes, their weapons, and their guilt from any late-night traveler or security camera. The second, more visceral breakthrough came from the water. In a region defined by its creeks, ponds, and deep, forgotten wells, the investigators knew that the most damning evidence would likely be found in the mud. They returned to the properties the Wagners had occupied before their flight to the north, specifically a farm in Adams County that held a stagnant, dark pond. Under the gray, overcast sky of an Ohio spring, a team of diverse and forensic specialists began a slow, rhythmic dredging of the water. This was the show, don't tell, of investigative persistence, men in heavy rubber suits disappearing into the murk, their hands searching blindly through the silt and the decayed leaves of a dozen seasons. For hours, they found nothing but the rusted junk of rural life. But then, a magnet fisherman working in coordination with the dive team felt a distinct, heavy pull. When the object was hauled to the surface, the air on the bank seemed to vanish. It was a piece of a firearm, a barrel and a slide from a .22 caliber handgun, the very caliber used to execute the 8 members of the Roden family. The forensic analysis of these parts was the final crack in the dam. The lab technicians discovered that the weapon had been meticulously modified. The serial numbers had been ground down with a professional-grade abrasive, and the internal components had been altered to accommodate a homemade silencer. This was the smoking gun, or rather, the skeletal remains of it. It proved that the killers weren't just random gunmen. They were individuals with the mechanical skill and the patience to craft their own tools of death. When the BCI cross-referenced the purchase of these specific gun parts with the Wagner family's financial records, the trail didn't just lead to them. It hit them like a freight train. The breakthrough was now a physical reality, a tangible link between a piece of metal in a muddy pond and the 8 bodies on Union Hill Road. But the most significant breakthrough was psychological. The investigators had been monitoring the Wagners in Alaska for over a year, watching as the family grew increasingly comfortable in their isolation. They noticed a change in the family's dynamic, a subtle shifting of the mask. The Wagners, perhaps believing they had successfully vanished into the vastness of the North, decided to return to Ohio. This move was the ultimate act of hubris. They thought the investigation had stalled permanently, that the experts in the city had given up on the hillbillies in the hollows. Their return in the spring of 2018 was the opportunity the BCI had been waiting for. The investigators didn't move immediately. They allowed the Wagners to settle back into the region, to feel the false security of their old haunts, while the trap was being meticulously set around them. The breakthrough then moved into the digital realm. With the family back on Ohio soil and under constant 24-hour surveillance, the authorities were able to secure warrants for their most private communications. They gained access to a trove of encrypted messages and social media data that revealed the why behind the how. They found the show, Don't Tell, evidence of Angela Wagner's obsessive control over her sons and her venomous hatred for Hannah Mae Roden. They found messages where the family discussed the custody of Sophia not as a legal matter, but as a crusade. The digital footprint revealed a family that lived in a state of shared delusion, believing that they were the only ones capable of protecting the child and that the roads were a poison that had to be eradicated. This wasn't a crime of one man. It was a communal pact, a blood oath taken by a mother, a father, and 2 sons. The tension reached a breaking point in November 2018. The BCI had enough evidence for an indictment, but they wanted the arrests to be as surgical as the crime itself. They didn't want to shoot out on a rural road. They wanted the Wagners in a controlled environment where they couldn't coordinate their stories or destroy any remaining evidence. On a cold, brisk morning, the tactical teams moved in. This was the cinematic climax of the investigation. In multiple simultaneous raids, the authorities descended on the Wagners. Billy and Angela were intercepted in their vehicle, while Jake and George IV were taken into custody at different locations. The show, Don't Tell, of the arrests was the look on their faces, not the shock of the innocent, but the cold, calculating silence of people who had been expecting this knock for 2.5 years. They didn't cry, they didn't scream. They simply withdrew into the fortress of their own minds, maintaining the family wall until the very end. The breakthrough was also found in the Gilley property, a piece of land the Wagners had once owned where a hidden well had been discovered. Inside that well, investigators found a secondary cache of evidence, more gun parts, specific tools used to manufacture silencers, and the misleading sneakers that had been seen in the mud on Union Hill Road. The Wagners had thought that the earth and the water would be their co-conspirators, that by dropping their secrets into the depths, they would be gone forever. But they had underestimated the sheer, dogged willpower of the people they had tried to outsmart. Every item pulled from that well was a nail in the coffin of their defense. The perfect crime was being undone by the very meticulousness they had used to execute it. By keeping the shoes and the tools, perhaps as trophies or out of a frugal rural habit, they had handed the state the keys to their prison cells. The most emotional breakthrough, however, happened in the interview rooms. While Billy, Angela, and George IV remained steadfast in their denials, the youngest son, Jake, began to show the first signs of a fracture. The investigators didn't use brute force. They used the one thing Jake cared about more than his own family, Sophia. They showed him the evidence. They showed him the photos of the crime scene, and they reminded him that his daughter would grow up knowing her father was a monster unless he told the truth. This was the breakthrough of the human heart, however dark and twisted it might be. Jake Wagner, the man who had pulled the trigger on the mother of his child, finally broke. The silence that had defined the case for 30 months was replaced by a confession that lasted for hours, a detailed, chilling account of how a family of 4 sat around a kitchen table and planned the murder of 8 people. Jake's confession provided the incident with its final, horrific clarity. He detailed the dry runs, the GPS tracking, and the specific roles each family member played. He confirmed that his mother, Angela, was the architect, providing the logistical support and the psychological fuel for the fire. He described how his brother, George, had acted as a scout and backup, and how his father, Billy, had been the tactical leader of the operation. The breakthrough was complete. It wasn't a cartel, it wasn't a drug debt, and it wasn't a random act of madness. It was a family business. The realization that an entire household had collaborated on the execution of their neighbors was a shock that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to process. It changed the nature of the case from a murder mystery to a study in collective sociopathy. The breakthrough phase ended with the public announcement of the arrests. The people of Pike County, who had lived in a state of paralyzing fear for nearly 1,000 days, finally received an answer. But the answer was more disturbing than the mystery. The killers weren't from across the border. They were from the next county over. They were people who had attended the same fairs, shopped at the same stores, and held the same values of rural autonomy. The breakthrough provided justice, but it also destroyed the sense of community that had once defined the region. It proved that in the hollows of southern Ohio, the deepest shadows aren't in the woods, but in the hearts of the people you think you know. As the news of the arrest spread, the war room at the BCI began to be dismantled. The maps were taken down, the photos were filed away, and the agents finally went home to their own families. They had achieved the impossible, breaking a case that had every hallmark of a permanent cold case. They had found the weapons in the water, the shoes in the well, and the truth in the heart of a killer. The breakthrough was a victory of patience over obsession, of science over stealth, and of the law over the blood oath. But as the investigators looked back at the trail of evidence, they knew that the most difficult part was still ahead. They had the confessions and the physical proof, but now they had to present this story of a family of monsters to a jury of their peers. The image that defines this part of the story is the sight of the modified trailer being hauled away by the police. It was a literal vessel of death, a physical manifestation of the Wagner's premeditation. It stood in the sunlight, its hidden compartments and reinforced walls exposed to the world, a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, it just hides behind a layer of plywood and a neighborly wave. The breakthrough had stripped away the plywood, leaving the Wagners with nowhere left to run. The silence of Union Hill Road had been replaced by the clink of handcuffs and the heavy tread of tactical boots, marking the end of the hunt and the beginning of the reckoning. In the final moments of this chapter, we must reflect on the sheer scale of the effort. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars, and a level of forensic dedication that is rarely seen in rural America. The breakthrough was a tribute to the 8 victims, a promise kept by the state that their lives mattered. It proved that no matter how deep you dig a well or how far north you run, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The Wagners had tried to erase a bloodline, but they had only succeeded in etching their own names in the records of infamy. The breakthrough was the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel, and as the sun set over the Ohio hills that November, the ghosts of the Roden family finally had a reason to rest. The narrative now shifts toward the courtroom, where the show, don't tell, of the evidence will be laid out for the world to see. The weapons from the pond, the shoes from the well, and the words of a son against his own blood will be the centerpiece of a trial that will haunt the state for generations. But the breakthrough remains the most cinematic part of the journey, the moment where the hunter becomes the prey, and the secrets of the hollow are finally brought into the light of day. It is a story of how a single, persistent question, why did the dog stay silent, eventually led to the dismantling of a family of killers. The breakthrough on Union Hill Road was a hard-won, bloody victory, and it serves as the ultimate reminder that in the world of true crime, the most important clues are often the ones that are whispered in the dark, waiting for someone with the courage to listen. The transition from the blood-soaked trailers of Union Hill Road to the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Pike County Courthouse was a journey that took 5 agonizing years, 3 weeks, and 2 days. By the time the legal reckoning finally arrived in the early 2020s, the shock that had once paralyzed southern Ohio had calcified into a heavy, resolute demand for justice. The air inside the courtroom in Waverly was thick with a tension that felt almost chemical, a mixture of the smell of floor wax, the hum of industrial air conditioning, and the collective, held breath of a community that had been hollowed out by a neighbor's betrayal. In the gallery sat the survivors, the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins of the 8 victims, their faces etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could ever cure. They wore T-shirts with the faces of Chris Sr., Dana, Hannah Mae, and the others, turning the courtroom into a silent congregation of the dead, all eyes fixed on the 4 individuals who had turned a custody dispute into a massacre. The atmosphere of the proceedings was defined by a profound, echoing silence that was broken only by the rhythmic rustle of legal papers and the low, clinical voices of the prosecutors. Anthony Sowell's trial had been about a singular monster, but the Wagner trial was about something far more disturbing, a family unit that had functioned as a death squad. At the defense table, the Wagners, Angela, Jake, and George IV sat in a formation that mirrored their tactical approach to the murders. They were stoic, their faces masks of rural defiance, appearing as if they were merely attending a tedious town hall meeting rather than a trial for the systematic erasure of a bloodline. This stoicism, however, was about to be shattered not by an external force, but by a rupture from within the family's own fortress of silence. The first and most devastating blow to the Wagner defense came on the 5th anniversary of the murders, April 22, 2021. In a move that sent shockwaves through the Appalachian foothills, Edward "Jake" Wagner, the man whose obsession with his daughter Sophia had served as the catalyst for the slaughter, entered a plea deal. The show, don't tell, of this moment was found in the way Jake refused to look at his brother or his mother as he stood before the judge. His voice, usually a low mumble, was clear and cold as he admitted to his role in all 8 murders. To avoid the death penalty for himself and his family, Jake had agreed to become the state's primary witness. The betrayal of blood was complete. The youngest son, the one for whom the war had been fought, was now the one holding the shovel to bury the rest of his clan. His confession provided the state with a roadmap of the incident, detailing how they had modified the trucks, how they had practiced their aim, and how they had moved through the Roden homes like ghosts. With Jake's confession as the foundation, the trial of George Wagner IV in late 2022 became a grueling, forensic autopsy of the family's obsession. While George IV maintained that he had never pulled a trigger, the prosecution meticulously built a case that painted him not as a bystander, but as a vital cog in the machinery of death. The evidence presented was a mountain of mundane items that, when viewed together, revealed a terrifying level of premeditation. The jurors were shown receipts from a Walmart in a different county where the Wagners had purchased specific, black-soled sneakers, the same shoes that left the prints found in the mud outside Dana Roden's trailer. They were shown the murder trailer, a modified hauler that the Wagners had used as a mobile armory, its hidden compartments still carrying the scent of gun oil and the cold residue of the Ohio night. The prosecution utilized the show, don't tell, technique with devastating effect during the presentation of ballistic and GPS evidence. On large screens, the jury watched as the digital footprints of the Wagner family's vehicles were overlaid onto a map of Pike County. They watched as 4 distinct blips moved in a synchronized, predatory dance on the night of April 22nd, converging on the Roden properties and then retreating back to the Wagner farm in the pre-dawn hours. This wasn't a theory. It was a digital ghost of the massacre. The air in the room grew cold as the lead prosecutor played recordings from bugs placed in the Wagner's truck after they returned from Alaska. The jury heard the family whispering, not in grief, but in a frantic, tactical analysis of the news reports, discussing how to dispose of the remaining evidence and how to keep their stories straight. The sound of Angela Wagner's voice, sharp, controlling, and devoid of empathy, served as the psychological heartbeat of the conspiracy. The testimony regarding the well on the Skidmore property provided the most visceral breakthrough of the trial. The jury listened in a state of stunned silence as investigators described the process of dredging the stagnant, dark water. They saw photos of the gun parts and the tools being pulled from the muck, covered in a layer of ancient, foul-smelling silt. This was the physical manifestation of the Wagners' attempt to bury the truth. The defense's argument that George IV was a good brother, who was simply dragged along by his family, began to dissolve under the weight of the evidence. The state proved that George had helped build the hidden compartments, that he had participated in the dry runs of the killings, and that he had stood watch while his brother and father executed his neighbors. In the eyes of the law, the man holding the flashlight is as guilty as the man pulling the trigger. The presence of the surviving children, the 3 infants who had been left in the blood-stained rooms, loomed over the trial like a silent indictment. While they were too young to testify, their existence was the primary why of the entire proceeding. The prosecution constantly reminded the jury of the selective mercy shown by the Wagners. They described the 4-day-old infant in Hannah Mae's arms, her tiny life spared only so she could be absorbed into the Wagner family's twisted vision of protection. This detail struck a chord with the jurors, highlighting the arrogance of a family that believed they had the right to decide who lived and who died based on a custody agreement. The trial wasn't just about murder. It was about the ultimate form of domestic kidnapping, a plan to steal a child by murdering everyone who loved her. The closing arguments were a masterclass in emotional and logical synthesis. The prosecutor stood before the jury, his eyes red from the weeks of testimony, and asked them to remember the silence of Union Hill Road. He asked them to visualize the Wagners sitting at their dinner table, passing around a map of their neighbors' homes, and deciding which person would die first. He spoke of the betrayal of a neighborly wave and the cold-blooded preparation that went into manufacturing silencers. The defense, in a last-ditch effort, tried to paint George IV as a victim of his mother's manipulation, a son who couldn't say no to his blood. But the image of the 8 black body bags being carried out of the trailers was too powerful a counter-narrative. The jury didn't see a victim. They saw a soldier in a family war. The deliberation lasted for several days, a period of agonizing uncertainty for the residents of Pike County. When the word finally came that a verdict had been reached, the streets around the courthouse were lined with people. The air was still, a rare moment of calm in the volatile Ohio weather. Inside, George Wagner stood as he had throughout the trial, shoulders back, face neutral, a man who seemed to believe his own lies. The clerk began to read the verdicts, a repetitive, hammer-like cadence that echoed through the room.
Guilty, guilty, guilty.
For every count of aggravated murder, for every count of conspiracy, and for every count of tampering with evidence, the word was a blow to the Wagner legacy. In total, George IV was found guilty on all 22 counts. A collective sob broke out from the Roden family, a sound of release that had been bottled up for 6 years. George IV didn't flinch. He merely blinked, his eyes remaining as cold as the well where he had tried to hide the guns. The sentencing phase provided the families with their final opportunity to speak directly to the man who had helped destroy their lives. One by one, the relatives of the Rhodes stood at the podium. They didn't offer forgiveness, and they didn't ask for explanations. They spoke of the missing pieces of their lives, the empty chairs at graduation, the birthdays that would never be celebrated, and the 3 children who would grow up with a story of a massacre instead of a family history. They looked at George IV and saw not a neighbor, but a void. The judge, in her final remarks, echoed this sentiment. She spoke of the unimaginable horror the Wagners had brought to the county and sentenced George IV to 8 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 121 years. It was a sentence designed to ensure that he would never again see the rolling hills of Ohio outside of a prison fence. The legal journey for the rest of the family followed a similar, inevitable path. Angela Wagner, the matriarch and the architect of the obsession, took a plea deal in exchange for a 30-year sentence, admitting to her role in the planning and the cover-up. She, who had once ruled her family with an iron will, was now just an inmate, her power stripped away by the very sons she had raised to be killers. Billy Wagner, the tactical leader, remains the final piece of the puzzle, his trial a looming shadow over the county as the legal system continues to grind toward a conclusion. But for the people of Pike County, the conviction of the 2 sons and the mother was the definitive end of the Wagner era. The family that had tried to steal a child by erasing her history had instead erased themselves. The justice of the Pike County massacre was not a moment of joy, but a moment of profound, exhausted relief. It was the closing of a book that no one had wanted to read. The legal process had taken the perfect crime and dismantled it piece by piece, proving that even in the most isolated hollows, the law has a long memory and a heavy hand. The evidence, the shoes, the gun parts, the GPS data, had told a story that the Wagners couldn't silence. The trial proved that the silence of the dogs was not a mystery, but a sign of a betrayal so deep it challenged the very definition of humanity. As George IV was led out of the courtroom in shackles, the sun was setting over Waverly, casting long, peaceful shadows over a town that could finally begin to heal. The impact of the trial on the state of Ohio was monumental. It led to a complete overhaul of how multi-jurisdiction rural crimes are investigated and how the BCI coordinates with local sheriffs. It became a case study in forensic persistence and the use of digital evidence to track ghost killers. But more importantly, it served as a warning to those who believe that blood loyalty is a shield against the law. The Wagners had believed they were a law unto themselves, a family unit that could operate outside the social contract. The justice phase proved them wrong. It showed that when a family chooses to become a criminal enterprise, they don't just risk their freedom, they risk their souls. In the final reflections on the trial, one cannot help but think of the 3 children. The justice delivered in that courtroom was, in many ways, for them. It was to ensure that the people who had murdered their parents would never have the chance to influence their lives again. The state had stepped in to do what the Rhodes no longer could, protect the youngest members of the family from the wolves who had been living next door. The verdicts were a promise kept to the 8 people buried in the Ohio soil, a promise that their deaths would not be a dead end, but a catalyst for the truth. The courtroom is empty now. The lawyers have moved on to other cases, and the transcripts have been filed away in the archives of the state. But the memory of the Wagner trial remains a permanent part of the landscape. It is the story of how a family's obsession was met with the unwavering light of the law. It is the story of how the invisible victims were finally seen and heard by a jury of their peers. And it is the story of how a neighbor's betrayal was met with a community's demand for a reckoning. The justice part of the script is the final, heavy chord in a tragedy that spanned years and miles, a reminder that while the night may belong to the killers, the morning always belongs to the truth. As we look at the final images of the Wagners in their orange jumpsuits, we see a family that has been utterly defeated by their own choices. They had everything, a farm, a home, and a future, and they threw it all away for a child they will never see again. They are a cautionary tale of what happens when love is replaced by control and when a family's bond becomes a suicide pact. The Rhodes are gone, but their names are written in the ledgers of justice, while the name Wagner has become a synonym for the darkest kind of Appalachian horror. The trial is over, the ban-on is final, and the hills of Pike County are, for the first time in a decade, truly quiet. The story of the Pike County Massacre concludes not with a shout, but with the quiet closing of a cell door. It is the sound of a debt being paid in the only currency the law accepts, time and truth. The 20,000 words of this kitsch ban lead us here, to a place where the blood has been washed away, the guns have been found, and the killers have been named. It is a journey through the heart of darkness, guided by the light of forensic science and the courage of those who refuse to let the Rhodes be forgotten. The justice was late, it was expensive, and it was heartbreakingly necessary. And as the people of Piketon return to their lives, they do so knowing that the shadows of Union Hill Road have finally been banished by the light of the law. The physical scars on Union Hill Road have begun to fade, swallowed by the relentless, patient hunger of the southern Ohio wilderness. If you drive past those stretches of gravel today, you won't see the yellow police tape or the black silhouettes of the mobile homes that once served as the setting for an American Gothic nightmare. The trailers were eventually hauled away, leaving behind rectangular patches of dry, flattened earth that the grass has since reclaimed, turning the sites of the massacre into anonymous clearings where the wind whispers through the tall weeds and the wild Queen Anne's lace. But to the people who call Pike County home, the aftermath is not something that can be erased by a bulldozer or covered with a layer of fresh topsoil. It is a permanent shift in the atmospheric pressure of the region, a haunting realization that the most dangerous monsters in the world don't hide in the deep woods or the dark caves of the Appalachian foothills. They sit in the pews of the local churches. They wave from the windows of passing trucks, and they share the same bloodlines that have defined these hills for 2 centuries. The legacy of the Rhoden family is now carried in the eyes and the quiet movements of 3 children who are growing up in a world that is fundamentally different because of the night of April 22nd. These children are the living, breathing monuments to a tragedy they are too young to remember but will never be old enough to forget. As they reach for milestones, the first day of school, a local fair, a graduation, they do so without the laughter of a mother, the calloused hands of a grandfather, or the protective presence of a clan that was once as sturdy as the Ohio Oaks. The show, don't tell, of the aftermath is found in the way the county looks at these survivors. There is a specific, heavy kind of kindness directed toward them, a collective effort to buffer them from the infamy of their last name and the shadow of the Wagner family's obsession. They are the proof that life persists, even when the forest has been clear-cut to the roots, but they are also a reminder of the staggering cost of a neighbor's malice. The Wagners themselves have transitioned from being a family to being a case study in collective sociopathy. They wanted to create a fortress, a world where they were the only ones who mattered, and where they could control the narrative of their own legacy. In the ultimate irony of the aftermath, they achieved exactly the opposite. Their name has become a curse in Southern Ohio, a synonym for the darkest kind of betrayal. Jake, George IV, and Angela are no longer a unit.